Hey everybody, welcome back to Final Trade. Let's talk about doing very powerful things with unrestricted decks. So we need to kind of have a history lesson here first. And the way it goes is that back in the mid 90s, there was a deck called Twiddle Vault. And it revolved, of course, around Time Vault. Now, Time Vault's kind of weird. It comes into play tapped, it doesn't untap during your untap phase, and you can only untap it, quote unquote, only by skipping a turn. So in a turn-based game, skipping a turn is typically pretty bad, but whenever you want to tap it, if it's untapped, you can tap it to take an extra turn. And so it's kind of like, hey, let's let you decide to give up a turn now in order to get an extra one later. And of course, all of these are proxies. You'll see why in a bit if you don't already. But this card is pretty interesting on its own. The fact that it only costs 2 mana is ridiculous. It's one of those lessons that the developers learned back in alpha and beta of, how to break cards by having them cost too little. And in the Twiddle Vault deck, people would pair it with, of course, Twiddle to untap the vault for 1 mana and then tap the vault to take an extra turn. But of course, Twiddle is just an instant. It goes to your graveyard. And so this Twiddle Vault deck grew up around the idea of how can we come up with ways to get Twiddle back and to get more Twiddles. And so it would use things like Ancestral Recall to draw 3 cards. It would use Demonic Tutor to search for the Twiddle. It would use Recall to pull Twiddles out of your graveyard. And then in the restricted tournament environment of the mid 90s, it would have one of each of the 5 Moxes. It would have one Black Lotus. You were restricted to one Demonic Tutor. It would have a Wheel of Fortune and, a lot of other very powerful cards of the day. And, it was an effective deck. But I was thinking, what could we do with this in terms of like the vintage Magic era with no restrictions? How ridiculous can we make this? Can we turn it into a deck that has a substantial first turn lockdown rate? And so what I mean by that, and we'll go now into the card that kind of makes this deck very ridiculous from Urza Saga Voltaic Key. So pay 1 mana and tap it to untap an artifact. Well, what would be a great artifact to untap every turn? Well, the Time Vault. Because then obviously you just get to take turns forever and your opponent does not get to take turns. So maybe he can interject something once in a while. But, as soon as you have 1 mana, a permanent mana source that provides 1 mana, like a land or a Mox, and you have both of these cards in play, you get a permanent lock on the board. Now, you'll see by the casting cost of these, it's a combined 3, plus you need the 1 to untap Voltaic Key, and since the Time Vault comes into play tap, you need to be able to pay that 1 to tap the key to untap this to take your extra turn. So you really need 4 mana. That's the threshold. So I came up and this was the first draft of the deck. It was 4 copies of each of these cards. And the idea was, how do you accelerate out a bunch of mana really early, get the Time Vault and the Voltaic Key into play, and, at least one either Mox or this is Underground Sea. It's the original blue-black dual land with no drawbacks. And how do you get all that stuff into play? 4 mana on the first turn and lock down the game. And I tooled around with this for a little bit. And, one thing you have to think of is, how do I actually win once I have the board locked down? And, you have some options like Millstone. You could mill your opponent to death. But you should expect they have about 60 cards in their deck, minus the 7 or 8 that they already drew. And so that leaves 52. So if you had one Millstone and you could pull it out fairly reliably, you would need 26 turns. But, I'm going for an ultra concentrated 40 card deck, and I would be drawing 7 cards and then using Ancestral Recall and Demonic Tutor to pull more cards out. And so Millstone probably wasn't the way to go, because you only mill 2 cards per turn per Millstone against their probably around 52 cards left in their deck. And so what I decided was just good old stupid Zeron Spellcaster. So throw him into play, and the nice thing about this is if your opponent went first, and let's say they threw down some kind of, a 1/1 first strike, then you wouldn't be reliant on attacking. You just go straight over any creature they may have played the first turn, and you just poke them to death with this. So I played around with this deck for a while, and what I realized pretty quickly was because it's a deck that has 4 copies of Demonic Tutor and 4 Ancestral Recalls, you can dig into the deck pretty effectively, and it really doesn't benefit you to have 4 copies of Time Vault and 4 copies of Voltaic Key. And so I turned those down to 1 copy. And similarly, I realized, hey, you can dig through the deck pretty effectively. You can get by with only 2 spellcasters instead of 4. And the nice thing about these changes is that it concentrates the rest of the cards, which are mana acceleration and card advantage and digging for specific cards. And so I thought, how could I further make, since I pulled out essentially 3 and 2 slots, so I pulled out 8 cards from this 40 card deck. What could I put in there that would make this even faster? And I thought, well, of course, Dark Ritual. That's a great accelerator. 4 of those. And, 4 Lim-Dûl's Vaults. Because, there's Demonic Consultation, but it requires you to actually remove from the game the first 6 cards of your library. And if one of those 6 is the key or the vault, well, then you're screwed. You're not going to do anything. So I went with Lim-Dûl's Vault instead. And the really cool thing about Lim-Dûl's Vault is, you search down until you find the set of 5 cards that you want, and then you put them in order on top of your library. But then if you cast an Ancestral Recall, you're essentially pulling 3 of those 5 into your hand, and you've chosen from all these groups of 5 that you've gone through one at a time, you've chosen 5 that you like, and then you've chosen the 3 that you want to put in your hand with Ancestral Recall. So it's a really powerful combo to search out things you want. And a lot of times what I find myself doing is I'll search until I find either the vault or the key, and hopefully there will be another Ancestral Recall within those 5 or a Black Lotus or something like that to try and accelerate more. So I played this some more, and then I realized, well, Twiddle doesn't really do much in this deck. And you get down to the key, and then you don't really need the Twiddle. And so Twiddle helps you on the mana side. It helps you to do this faster with less mana on the first turn. But I realized it would probably be better served if I could somehow wring some more card advantage out of this deck. And so I took those Twiddles out, and I experimented a lot with Vampiric Tutor. And so, the thing about Vampiric Tutor is it's kind of a trade-off version of Lim-Dûl's Vault. And so you only get 1 card on top of your deck instead of rearranging 5, but you don't have to trade the life, which is not a big deal, but it's kind of like a weaker version, but it's only 1 mana instead of 2. And man, I'll tell you, mana is really, really, really slim in this deck. And so it's difficult to kind of judge, like, how good is Vampiric Tutor? And I thought, well, is there something better to put in? Because what I realized is, the trick I talked about where you have Lim-Dûl's Vault to arrange some cards on top, and then you use Ancestral Recall to pull them into your hand. At this point, you have 8 cards to arrange stuff on top of your deck, but you only have 4 cards to put them in your hand. And I thought, what else do we have? And so I thought of 2 cards. One is Impulse. It's a blue instant from Visions that's 2 mana. You get to look at the top 4 cards of your library, put one of them in your hand, and put the rest on the bottom of your deck. But the thing is, part of the power of Lim-Dûl's Vault is that you already arranged the top cards. So putting them down on the bottom of the deck defeats that purpose. I didn't really like that. And so finally I thought, oh yeah, Brainstorm. So it's a much, 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 much weaker version of Ancestral Recall. You get to pull 3 cards into your hand, and then you take any 2 out of your hand and put them on top of your library. And the nice thing about that is that occasionally you'll draw 2 or 3 Underground Seas on the first turn, and you can't do anything with that besides play one of them and hold the other ones. And sometimes if you have multiple Lim-Dûl Vaults in your hands, you'll put some of those back on top of the library with Brainstorm. And so I tooled around with this and goldfished about 50 hands, and what I found was that in a configuration similar to this, I could get a first turn win about 30% of the time, and a second turn win about 50% of the time. And so the other 20% of games would be either a third turn or more. And once in a while you do get kind of hosed. You know, you'll draw too many moxes and maybe you'll draw the key or something, but you don't draw any of your cards that really let you dig and pull cards, extra cards out of your library. And so you're just kind of sitting around waiting for your one draw every turn to kind of do something to get you accelerated again. But those hands are pretty rare. So I think this is interesting. I'd like to know if any of y'all have any suggestions on other cards that could help accelerate this deck more. You know, this is just kind of a silly exercise in when you remove all the restriction rules, how fast can you lock down a game? Now, obviously, this deck takes a long time to win because you have to get the Zuron spellcasters out and then you have to slowly poke your opponent to death. But how quick can you lock down the game? And that's the big thing. Maybe I misspoke a minute ago when I said first turn win, but it's a first turn lock on the board so that your opponent no longer gets to take turns. And I'll put the list, the deck list of what I'm currently just kind of toying around with here in the description section of this video. But I'd like to hear if there's any cards I'm just not aware of. You know, I tried a little bit with Infernal Contract. You know, it's kind of in the same vein, but the reality is it just costs too much mana. And that was really its problem. And I also thought a little bit about what if I expanded this to a 60 card deck, but I think that waters it down way too much. When you're trying to do something ultra gimmicky like this, having a smaller deck is just always going to be better when you're looking for things like how many Moxes and Ancestral Recalls can I play on the first turn. You really want the concentrated deck. So let me know what you think and what your suggestions are in your comments, and I'd love to hear some feedback from you. So if you like this kind of thing, like, comment, share, and subscribe, and join me on Final Trade. Thanks a lot, everyone.